What I'd like to do, members, is step you through at a high level the findings and issues we identified in the report, and then again at a fairly high level discuss a few of the recommendations that we made not only to the University of California, the Office of the President, but to the Board of Regents, and certainly legislative recommendations as well. So the first issue I'd like to discuss is exactly what you mentioned, Mr. Maritsucci, is the determination that we have in the report that there is $175 million of fund balance, essentially funds that were available at the end of fiscal year 15-16. So as of June 30th, 2016, the Office of the President had $175 million. Now, $83 million of that is in restricted accounts. What they consider restricted funds. They may be restricted based on grants, based on appropriations, some type of specific restriction. However, another $92 million was in what they call a discretionary fund. So those are funds that are available, have a lot of flexibility for the Office of the President to use those funds. When we looked at a 5-year window that we were asked to look, again, this ending fund balance fluctuated, but again, the focus in the report is the 2015-16. Now, we decided to drill down and really look at the discretionary funds and see whether or not that was a consistent situation over time or whether that was just, this one particular fiscal year. And what we found, I'm hopeful that the sergeant handed out do you all have the one-page handout? So if you look at, and there's a lot of numbers on this figure, but if you focus on the right hand, the bar chart on the right-hand side at the bottom, that shows you their discretionary fund balances as of the end of each of the fiscal years that we looked at. And as you can see, that amount has grown over time. So they are continuing to have money available at the end of the year, and that fund is growing. What is also important to note in there, the green shading, is the campus assessment amount. And as I'm sure you're aware, members, the Office of the President, their central administrative function, their operations, is essentially funded by this campus assessment. About 90% of their funding comes from the campus assessment. What was of concern to us is even though they have this available money at the end of each year, they were not disclosing this to the regents when they were sharing either a request for an increase in the campus assessment from one year to the next. They also weren't sharing with the regents the amount they had in restricted balances as well, but the discretionary was really of concern to us. Over those years, as I said, the campus assessment grew. There were at least 2 years where they hadn't spent all of the campus assessment monies they had received in that year, yet they went back to the regents and asked for an increase. And that, again, was of concern to us because we felt they had those funds available to them and didn't necessarily need to ask the regents to approve an increase in the campus assessment. And as Mr. Maritsucci said and Mr. McCarty said, those monies could have remained at those respective campuses and been used by those campuses for other purposes to support students, faculty, etc. That's why we raised that as a particular concern. As I indicated, the restricted funds, there's $83 million. Now, there's some discussion, or has been since the audit was released, that those monies are not available at all for any kind of redistribution. We would disagree with that. The reason we disagree with that is in discussions with the Office of the President, there are over 340 funds that make up that restricted balance. Over 100 of those, 114 of those funds are actually restrictions that the University Office of the President self-imposed. So these are restrictions that they could potentially reverse depending upon what the priorities are. For example, the Searles Fund is a fund that the Office of the President had considered a restricted fund up until fiscal year 11-12. It's about an annual amount of $7 million. That has been shifted to the discretionary pot, essentially. So that is no longer a restricted fund. So that's why we believe it's necessary to go back and look at some of those 114 to see if there are some funds available in that balance that perhaps could be redirected or returned to the campuses used for other purposes. The more flexibility and the discussion again that's been out there is this $92 million in the discretionary amount. And as I'm sure you've heard You've seen in our report where the Office of the President is asserting that $54 million of that has been committed for future projects that are occurring during this current fiscal year of 16-17. Therefore, they really only have $38 million in reserve. And what I wanted to discuss with you today is we disagree with that particular conclusion. First of all, the calculations were ours. We came up with the 175 and then sat down with the Office of the President and got the amount that is in restricted funds and then the discretionary. Then we asked them, well, what are you going to do with all this discretionary money? And they came up with the $54 million, and then ultimately you end up with 38, which now they're asserting is their reserve. We don't, first of all, the Office of the President has acknowledged in the response to the report, and I think they will acknowledge today, they don't have a reserve policy. They've never established a reserve amount. So if there's an initiative that is successful, and one example in their budget documents is UC Press, and they essentially said in their budget documents to the Finance Committee, this thing is almost entirely self-supporting. Very successful initiative. Well, does that mean essentially some of that funding could be freed up for other purposes? That certainly is a question when I saw that information that I asked. And those are the kinds of things that we believe the university needs to do, needs to have that comprehensive list, needs to understand what the intent is, how much is being spent, and what benefits are we deriving, or is the university deriving from these initiatives. Now, credit to President Napolitano. In 2014, she put out a directive and asking the Office of the President to look at its size, shape, role, mission, and really wanting to try to identify internal redundancies and any overlap. Unfortunately, we didn't see any results of that particular analysis. We do believe the analysis was done, but we didn't really see any really significant change as a result of that directive that she put out. In fact, staffing increased. But if you don't have a workforce plan and you don't have information that justifies why you believe your staffing needs to increase, that's a problem. In looking at salaries, certainly there are executives at the Office of the President make significantly more than state employees or employees in the public sector. And in many cases, higher education, we don't take an issue with that because, as we all know, higher education is very competitive. We want the best and the brightest to work for the University of California and our system here in California. However, we also looked at administrative staff who perform functions that are not that different than administrative staff working for the state of California, working for local government, etc. And we really felt that there was a big difference there, and that the Office of the President could take a harder look at some of their administrative salaries. The salary ranges are significantly different than state employees. We use a few examples in the report where the Director of Human Resources for the system works at the Office of the President compared it to our Department of Human Resources here in California, the Director of an agency that's responsible for over 200,000 state employees. And we felt that the salaries were significantly different. So that's an area we believe the Office of the President really needs to take a hard look at. The other issue that we tried to address in the report is really looking at redundancies. I know the members who requested this audit were very interested in determining is there any duplication between functions that are occurring at the Office of the President and functions that are occurring at the campuses. This is the area, unfortunately, where the Office of the President, based on evidence that we have, interfered with that process. When we sent the surveys out to the campuses, we sent two surveys, one to assess the services that the Office of the President provides. So we had a conversation with the Office of the President. We need to know all the services that you provide the campuses. And then when we provided the survey to the campuses, there was language on those surveys. You need to keep this information confidential within your campus community. Communicate with us. My staff had verbal communications with the audit liaison with the Office of the President, suggesting if you have logistical questions, that's not an issue, but if there are specific questions at the campuses should be communicating with staff at the auditor's office. We really wanted the campuses to have the opportunity to provide an independent voice and tell us what services they use, what services they find very valuable, what services perhaps they don't use. and perhaps reasons why. Maybe they're a large campus, they don't need certain services. But we were really trying to get a handle on all of the services that the Office of the President provides, the satisfaction from the campus's perspective of the value of those services, and hopefully we're going to identify perhaps some services that could have been eliminated, or if there was duplication, perhaps to eliminate the duplication at one end or the other, either at the campus level or at the Office of the President. Unfortunately, what we found out is that prior to those surveys being submitted to my office, the Office of the President reached out to all the campuses, held a conference call, and had a discussion about the surveys. We were later able to determine, based on information the Office of the President gave to us, that some of those surveys were modified. So we got copies of the draft surveys that the campuses sent to the Office of the President. When we got the final survey, some of those answers had been changed. First is to appropriate funds directly to the Office of the President through an annual budget process. This would ultimately eliminate the need for there to be a campus assessment. So if the legislature decides to directly appropriate funds for the Office of the President, now we're not talking about the university system as a whole. I know there's been concerns raised about constitutional autonomy. I mean, certainly when I met with President Lozano, Regent Lozano and a couple other regents, they did raise that as a concern, as they noted in the report. Their letter to me is in the report, and we considered their concerns. So we do not think that our recommendation to suggest that the legislature directly appropriate an amount specifically for the Office of the President is any concern with respect to constitutional autonomy. The other recommendation that we made to the legislature is with respect to the regents, and we're suggesting that the regents use some of that appropriation to contract with an independent third party. We think that's necessary because what we have suggested throughout the audit report is a 3-year plan. So we want to give the Office of the President the opportunity over the next 3 years to really right the ship as far as their budgeting practices, disclosure of information, information related to the initiatives, and that's going to take some time. Certainly issues related to their staffing and their staffing costs. So we have specific elements that we've identified that we think need and can be achieved over the next 3 years. But we think the regents need to provide oversight. They certainly have that responsibility, and we believe an independent third party would provide great assistance to the regents in monitoring how the Office of the President is doing in implementing that corrective action plan. We certainly think the legislature has an oversight role, much like the hearing today. Our suggestion is that the legislature could have oversight hearings and have the Office of the President, the independent third party, present their progress as they are working their way through the 3-year corrective action plan.